She was a thing tied to a post. Not a woman, not a girl, but a collection of frayed buckskin and black hair that fell like a horse's tail, hiding the line of her jaw. The sun beat down on the crown of her head, turning the dust of the street into a haze that shimmered and danced. It clung to her like a second skin, a fine grit that worked its way into the cracks of her lips and the corners of her eyes. Her hands were bound behind the splintered wood of the town's central hitching rail, the rope coarse and biting. She did not pull against it. The fight had bled out of her days ago, leaving behind a stillness that was deep and cold, like river water in winter. Men walked past. Some spat in the dust near her bare feet. Their spittle dried almost instantly, turning into dark little stars in the pale dirt. Others laughed, their voices thick with liquor and derision. They were wolves, this pack of them, their teeth showing not in snarls but in greasy smiles. They circled her with their eyes, measuring her worth in pelts and whiskey. The main one, a man with a beard stained yellow from tobacco, was the one who held her invisible leash. He called himself Silas. He had a voice that sounded like rocks grinding together. She kept her gaze fixed on a loose board on the opposite saloon porch. She counted the knots in the wood. 1, 2, 3. A dark one near the bottom looked like a closed eye. She focused on that eye, pouring all the screaming that was left inside her into that small wooden void. The sounds of the town, the clink of glasses, the whinny of a tired horse, the sharp, barking laughter of the men, became a distant hum, the buzz of flies on a dead thing. She was learning to be a dead thing. It was safer. The crowd shifted. They grew bored. The novelty of her, the silent, dark-haired prize Silas had dragged into this sorry excuse for a town, was wearing thin. The sun was too hot. The whiskey was waiting. They began to drift away, their interest evaporating like morning mist. Only Silas and his 2 lackeys remained, leaning against the saloon wall, their shadows long and ugly in the afternoon light. Then another shadow fell, this one different. It was not long and distorted but solid, whole. It blocked the harsh sun from her face. She did not look up. Looking up was a mistake. Looking up invited things. Elias had seen her when he first rode into town. He had seen the small, huddled shape tied to the post and the lazy circle of men. It was a sight as common and as bitter as alkali dust in this part of the country. He had carried on to the mercantile. His face set in the stoic lines grief had carved there years ago. He bought flour, salt, and 3 iron nails he didn't need, the cool metal heavy in his palm. He listened to the storekeeper's chatter, his own voice a low rumble when he had to use it. But the image of her stayed behind his eyes, a ghost pinned by the sun. He had a wife once, Sarah. She had hair the color of wheat fields before the harvest and hands that were never still. The sickness had taken her in a winter so cold the air itself seemed to shatter. He had buried her on the small rise behind their cabin, next to the smaller grave of their son, who had never drawn a breath. After that, Elias had stitched his life together with the raw, silent thread of duty. You get up. You feed the stock. You mend the fence. You breathe in, you breathe out. You don't invite things in. But this was a splinter under the thumbnail, a wrongness that dug in and festered. He walked back out into the glare of the main street. The crowd had thinned. Silas was arguing with the saloon keeper, his voice rising in frustration. She's worth 10 good blankets. At least. Elias walked straight toward the post, his worn boots making no sound in the thick dust. He stopped in front of her, his shadow a gift of sudden coolness. He saw the tremble in her shoulders, so slight it was almost just the heat rising from the ground. He saw the cracked skin of her feet, the way her knuckles were white where her hands were bound. He carried whole winters in his eyes, and in them, he saw another winter beginning for her. He didn't speak to Silas. He didn't look at the other men. He looked at the rope. He reached into his coat, his movements slow, deliberate. He pulled out a worn leather purse. The sound of the drawstring opening was unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet. Silas stopped yelling and turned, his eyes narrowing. Elias tossed the purse onto the ground between them. It landed with a soft, heavy thud. Not a jingle of many coins, but the dull weight of a few. "That's my last offer, Silas," Elias said, his voice flat. It was not a bargain. It was a statement. It sounded like it came from under floorboards, dusty and unused. Silas looked from the purse to Elias, then to the girl. A flicker of something, greed, annoyance, relief, passed over his face. He wanted to be rid of her. She was more trouble than she was worth, and this quiet, haunted-looking farmer was a simple solution. He spat a stream of tobacco juice. "For what? My trouble?" "For your silence," Elias said. "And for you to turn around and ride out." Silas smirked, but there was no humor in it. He gestured to one of his men, who swaggered forward and scooped up the purse. He looked inside, nodded. It was enough. More than enough for a few nights of cheap whiskey. Silas gave a mock bow. "She's all yours, farmer. Don't expect she'll be much use." Hasn't said a word. Elias ignored him. He turned his back on them completely, a dismissal more profound than any insult. He faced the girl, who still hadn't moved, her head bowed. He pulled a small, sharp knife from his belt. The blade caught the sun for a brief, blinding moment. He saw her flinch, a violent shudder that ran through her whole body. He knelt. He didn't touch her. He reached behind the post, his arm brushing against the rough wood, and slid the blade between the rope and her skin. He cut upwards, away from her. The rope fell apart with a soft sigh. Her hands remained behind her back for a long moment, as if they had forgotten any other way to be. Then, slowly, painfully, she brought them forward, laying them in her lap. The skin of her wrists was raw, rubbed red and purple. Elias stood up, sheathing his knife. He did not offer a hand. He did not speak. He simply turned and began walking toward his horse and wagon at the edge of town, his steps even and unhurried. He did not look back to see if she was following. The choice had to be hers. That was the only part of this that mattered. For a full minute, she remained by the post, a ship loosed from its mooring, adrift in the silent, dusty sea of the street. The town held its breath. She looked at the raw, open sores on her wrists. She looked at the dark shapes of Silas and his men mounting their horses to ride east. Then she looked at the back of the man walking west. He was thin as a fence rail, his coat hanging from his shoulders, but his back was straight. She got to her feet. Her legs were stiff, protesting. Every muscle screamed. She took one step, then another. The dust was hot under her bare feet, then cooler in the shade of the buildings. She followed the steady, rhythmic pace of his retreat, a small, silent shadow trailing a larger one. Dust lifted behind them like ghosts. The journey to his homestead was made of silence, a thick, heavy silence that sat between them in the wagon bed. He had gestured for her to climb in, and she had obeyed, curling into a corner, making herself as small as possible. The sun beat down, and the wheels of the wagon cut two straight lines into the vast, unforgiving prairie. The land itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. Once, he stopped the wagon and held out a canteen. The metal was warm from the sun. She hesitated, her eyes flickering to his face for the first time. His eyes were the color of a faded blue sky, and they held a deep, settled sadness that was somehow less frightening than the wild cruelty she was used to. She took the canteen. Her hands trembled as she drank. The water was metallic and lukewarm, but it was the kindest thing she had felt in months. She drank until her throat stopped burning, then handed it back. Their fingers did not touch. He did not ask her name. He did not ask her where she came from. The silence was a language they both understood. It was a shield. They arrived as dusk was bleeding blood orange and purple across the horizon. The cabin was small, built of hand-hewn logs chinked with mud and grass. It stood alone, a solitary shape against the endless sky. A curl of smoke rose from the stone chimney, thin and lonely. To one side stood a sturdy barn, its wood weathered to a soft silver. Behind the cabin, on a gentle slope, was a single, simple grave marker made of white stone. The place had an air of quiet neglect. Weeds grew thick against the foundation. A fence leaned tiredly to one side. It was a home that had lost its heart. It felt like him. Solid, weathered, and hollowed out by loss. He led the horse to the trough, his movements economical and practiced. She slid from the wagon, her bare feet sinking into the cool, damp earth near the well. She stood there, waiting, clutching her own elbows. She did not know the rules of this place. He finished with the horse and turned to her. He gestured toward the cabin door. "Food," he said. The word was rough, as if he had to pull it up from a deep well. Inside, the cabin was one room. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs stood in the center. A bed, neatly made with a patchwork quilt, was in one corner. In the other, a pallet of straw and a single, clean blanket had been laid out on the floor. Her space, safe. He moved to the hearth, stirring a pot that hung over the low embers. The smell of stew, thin, but savory with rabbit and wild onions, filled the small space. He ladled it into 2 wooden bowls. He placed one on the table, then the other opposite it. He sat down and looked at her, a silent invitation. She moved to the table slowly, her bare feet silent on the wide plank floor. She sat on the edge of the chair, her back straight. She did not eat. She waited. For what? She wasn't sure. A command? A blow? He ate a spoonful of his own stew. "It's safe," he said, not looking at her. She picked up the spoon, felt heavy, foreign. She ate. The warm food spread through her, a slow, creeping tide of life pushing back the cold. They ate in complete silence, the only sounds the scrape of spoons against wood and the soft crackle of the fire. When she was finished, he took her bowl without a word and washed them both in a basin of water. He pointed to the pallet on the floor. "You can sleep there. I don't lock the door." She watched him as he checked the fire, his shoulders slumped with a weariness that seemed older than his years. He banked the embers for the night, then moved to his own bed, pulling off his boots with a tired sigh. He lay down on top of the quilt, fully clothed, and turned his face to the wall. She lay down on the pallet, the straw rustling beneath her. The blanket was coarse wool, but it was clean. For the first time in a very long time, she was warm. She was inside. There was a roof over her head and a man in the room who had asked for nothing, who had not touched her, who did not lock the door. She lay awake for hours, listening to the new sounds. The sigh of the wind around the corners of the cabin, the steady, quiet breathing of the man in the bed, the creak of the house as it settled. It was the sound of a fragile peace. And in that peace she finally slept. The days that followed fell into a rhythm, as quiet and steady as a heartbeat. Life was measured not in words, but in work. He would rise before the sun, his movements spare and quiet, and go out to the barn. She would wake to the light seeping through the single window and the smell of wood smoke as he rekindled the fire. She began to claim small corners of the cabin as her own. She swept the floorboards until they were clean of all but the most stubborn dust. She found a chipped tin cup and put a spray of wild prairie flowers in it, setting it on the windowsill. She watched him work from the doorway, learning the cadence of his chores, the sharp thud of the axe-splitting wood, the rhythmic creak of the pump handle, the low murmur of his voice as he spoke to the horse. He never told her what to do. He left the space for her to fill. One morning, she found a pile of his mending beside the hearth. A shirt with a torn sleeve, trousers with a worn knee. She found a needle and thread in a small wooden box on the mantelpiece, a box that also held a single, small silver locket. She did not touch the locket. She sat by the fire and stitched the fabric with small, neat seams. The work was familiar, calming. When he came in for his midday meal, he saw the mended clothes, folded neatly on his chair. His eyes rested on them for a long moment. He looked at her, a question in his gaze. She was stirring the soup, her back to him. He said nothing, but that evening, when he came in from the fields, He laid a pair of his late wife's shoes on the floor by her pallet. They were worn but sturdy and they fit. Her world, which had been the size of a hitching post, slowly expanded. It grew to the edges of the cabin, then to the well, then to the small, untended garden patch behind the house. She pulled the weeds, her fingers working the soil, turning it over. She found a few straggling herbs, thyme, rosemary, and tended to them. The earth felt good under her hands. It was honest. One afternoon, she walked up the small rise to the grave marker. The wind was gentle here, whispering through the tall grass. The stone was simple, Sarah, beloved wife, and beneath it, a smaller, rougher stone, Isaac. She traced the letters with her fingers. She understood the hollowness in the cabin now. It was not emptiness, but absence. She straightened up and pulled a few stubborn weeds from around the base of the stones. She did not have a flower, so she laid a single, smooth white pebble on top of Sarah's marker. An offering, a piece of silence for a silent place. Elias saw her from the barn. He saw her small figure outlined against the vast sky, her head bowed. He saw her place the stone. A knot in his chest, one he had carried for so long he had forgotten it was there, seemed to loosen just a little. When she came back to the cabin, he had just finished baking bread. He cut a thick, warm slice from the loaf and held it out to her. It was heavy, a little burnt on the bottom. She took it, her eyes meeting his. For the first time, the corner of her mouth lifted in a smile so small it was barely there. "A little dry," she whispered. Her voice was thin, reedy, like a bird's call after a long winter. He was so startled to hear her speak that he almost dropped the knife. A slow, rusty smile touched his own lips. "You didn't complain about my stew." "The stew was good," she said, her voice a little stronger now. "It was a beginning." Not long after, a nightmare clawed its way out of the darkness. She woke with a gasp, the feel of coarse rope on her wrists, the jeering faces of the wolves leaning over her. She sat bolt upright on her pallet, a silent scream trapped in her throat. The room was dark, the fire banked to low red embers. "You're safe." His voice came from the darkness across the room. It was low and steady, not a question but a fact. She was trembling, wrapping her arms around her knees. "Don't lock me in," she pleaded, the words tumbling out, raw and terrified. "Please, don't ever lock the door." He was quiet for a long moment. Then she heard the sound of him getting out of his bed. His bare feet padded softly on the floorboards. He walked not to her, but to the cabin door. He opened it. A sliver of cool, moonlit air slid into the room. He left it ajar. "I don't lock doors," he repeated softly. He went back to his bed. She sat there, shivering, watching the thin line of moonlight on the floor. It was a promise. She lay back down, and though sleep did not come for a long time, the terror began to recede, chased away by the sliver of night air and the sound of his steady breathing. Their fragile peace was shattered by the dust. A plume of it, rising on the western horizon, too deliberate for a dust devil, too large for a single rider. Elias saw it from the roof of the barn, where he was patching a loose shingle. He stopped, his hammer held aloft, and watched the dust cloud grow, resolving itself into the shapes of 3 riders. He knew, with a certainty that settled like a cold stone in his gut, who it was. He climbed down the ladder, his face grim. He didn't run. He walked with a steady pace to the cabin. She was outside, hanging laundry on a line he had strung for her between 2 posts. She had found a bar of his wife's lye soap and washed everything in the cabin that could be washed. The white sheets billowed in the wind, bright against the blue sky. She looked up and saw his face. She followed his gaze to the horizon. All the color drained from her face. The life he had seen slowly returning to her eyes. The light, the spark, vanished, leaving behind the old, familiar terror. She froze, a clothespin held in her hand, the damp sheet flapping against her arm. "Go inside," he said, his voice low and even. She didn't move. Her feet seemed rooted to the ground. "A pony," he said. He did not know her name, so he gave her one from a story his mother used to tell, a name that meant butterfly, a thing of fragile beauty that could fly away. Go inside the cabin. Stay away from the window. The sound of the name, spoken with such quiet authority, seemed to break the spell. She turned and fled into the cabin, the screen door slamming shut behind her. Elias walked to the center of the yard, halfway between the house and the approaching riders. He picked up the axe he'd been using earlier, its weight familiar in his hand. He didn't brandish it. He just held it, letting it rest against his leg. He stood there and waited. It was Silas, of course. Him and the same two men, their faces smug, their horses swaggering. They reined in a few yards from Elias, forming a half-circle, penning him in against his own home. "Farmer," Silas drawled, leaning on his saddle horn. "Looks like you've been busy. Place almost looks respectable." His eyes flickered to the laundry line, to the tended garden. "And you've been working my property hard, I see." "She's not your property," Elias said. The axe felt heavy in his hand. "Solid." Silas laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "I got a bill of sale says otherwise. Contract. We had a deal, you and I. I sold her to a man up north, a man who pays better than you. I'm just here to collect what's mine." "You took my coin," Elias stated. "The deal was you ride out." "You did." "Plans change," Silas sneered. "Now you can make this easy. Send her out. I won't even rough you up too bad." One of his men chuckled and spat on the ground. Elias didn't move. He was a rock, a part of the landscape. "You're not setting foot on this land. And you're not taking her." Silas's face hardened. The greasy smile fell away, revealing the wolf beneath. "You're either the kindest man I've ever met, or the most foolish. Can't I be both?" Elias asked, his voice dry. "You're a dead man is what you are," Silas snarled, and he began to dismount, reaching for the pistol at his hip. The cabin door flew open. Pony stood there, framed in the doorway. She held Elias's old hunting rifle. It was heavy, far too big for her, the barrel wavering slightly, but her hands were steady. Her face was a mask of cold fury. All the fear burned away, leaving something hard and bright as flint. "Get away from him," she said. Her voice was not a whisper now. It was clear and sharp, and it cut through the tense air like a knife. Silas froze, 1 foot out of the stirrup. He stared at her, genuinely shocked. The silent, broken thing was holding a rifle on him. "Well, I'll be," he breathed. "The little prairie mouse learned how to squeak." "She's not a mouse," Elias said, his voice dangerously quiet. "And this is her home." He took a step, placing himself slightly in front of her, shielding her body with his own but leaving her a clear line of sight. They stood together, a united front. The farmer with his axe, the girl with her rifle. A silent, unyielding wall. Silas looked from the unwavering barrel of the rifle to the cold, dead certainty in Elias's eyes. He saw no fear there, no room for negotiation. He was a bully and a coward, and he preyed on the weak. These two people, standing together in the dust of their yard, were no longer weak. He hesitated, his bluster failing him. That hesitation cost him. From over the rise, another cloud of dust appeared. This one was much larger, much faster. It was not the lazy plume of a few riders, but the thundering announcement of many. A war party. 50, maybe more, riders cresting the hill, their forms dark against the sky. They were not painted for war, but they carried themselves with the coiled deadliness of coiled snakes. They were her people. Silas and his men saw them. Pure, primal fear washed over their faces. They scrambled back onto their horses, fumbling with the reins. The imagined profit, the petty cruelty, it all evaporated in the face of this new, overwhelming threat. Silas shot one last look at Elias and a pony, a look of hatred and bafflement, before kicking his horse into a desperate gallop, his men close behind, fleeing not from the farmer, but from the ghosts that had risen from the prairie to protect their own. Elias and a pony stood, unmoving, as the gang of three disappeared into the distance. The thunder of hooves grew louder, closer. The warriors did not slow. They swept down the gentle slope and surrounded the farmstead, their horses churning the dust. They formed a wide, silent circle around the cabin, the barn, the well. Around him, around her, there were 50 of them, maybe more. Silent riders on painted ponies, their faces impassive, their dark eyes missing nothing. They held lances and bows. They were an army, and he was one man with an axe, standing beside a girl with a rifle she barely knew how to hold. The tension was a living thing, a pressure in the air that made it hard to breathe. This was not a rescue. This was a reckoning. Elias did not raise his axe. He let the head of it rest on the ground, holding the handle loosely. He stood his ground, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He looked at the leader, a man with streaks of white in his braided hair and eyes that seemed to see right through him, into the hollowed-out places in his soul. Pony lowered the rifle. She took a step forward past Elias. She stood before him, turning her back on him to face her people. It was an act of supreme trust. She raised a hand, palm open. She began to speak. Her voice, which had been a whisper, then a command, now flowed in the liquid, musical cadence of her own tongue. It was a story. He could not understand the words, but he understood the telling. He heard the fear in it, the pain of the hitching post, the cruelty of the wolves. Then the tone shifted. He heard the journey, the silent wagon ride. He heard the cabin, the pallet on the floor, the open door. He heard his own name for her, a pony, spoken with a softness that made the air shimmer. She pointed not at him, but at the house, at the garden, at the laundry line with his clean clothes dancing in the wind. She was not pleading. She was testifying. The leader listened, his gaze never leaving her face. Then he looked past her at Elias. His eyes moved from Elias's face to his hands, resting loosely on the axe handle. He saw the house, the grave on the hill. He saw everything. When she finished speaking, a profound silence fell over the yard. It was broken only by the snorting of the horses and the whisper of the wind. The leader nudged his horse forward, stopping directly in front of a pony. He looked down at her, then shifted his gaze to Elias. He spoke a single, guttural question. Pony turned to Elias. He asks your name. Elias, he said, his voice steady. She translated. Then she looked back at him, her dark eyes searching his. He asks, why you took me? Elias looked past her, at the 50 silent warriors, at the endless prairie beyond. He thought of his wife, of the empty space she left. He thought of the hollow echo in the cabin, of a life stitched together with nothing but duty. He looked at a pony, at the strength that had bloomed in her like a stubborn desert flower. The house was quiet, he said simply. She held his gaze for a long moment, and in her eyes, he saw that she understood everything. The grief, the loneliness, the unspoken need not for a servant, but for a reason, for a life to fill the silence. She turned back to the leader and spoke, her voice soft but firm. The leader listened, his expression unreadable. Then he gave a short, sharp nod. He raised a hand, and as one, the circle of warriors broke. They began to turn their horses, their movements fluid and controlled. They did not leave in a rush. They flowed away, melting back into the prairie from which they came, leaving nothing behind but the churned dust and the ringing silence. The leader was the last to leave. He paused, looking once more at a pony, and then at Elias. He nodded again, a gesture of profound, unsmiling respect. Then he too was gone. They stood alone in the yard, the dust settling around them in the late afternoon sun. The rifle sagged in her arms, suddenly too heavy to hold. He gently took it from her and leaned it against the cabin wall. She looked up at him, her face streaked with dust and tears he hadn't seen her shed. My name is not a pony, she said, her voice barely a whisper. It is Lena. He nodded slowly. Lena, he repeated. The name fit her. It was strong. It was real. It's a good name. He turned and walked toward the cabin. He stopped at the door and looked back at her. "The stew will be getting cold," he said. A smile touched her lips, a real one this time, full of light and relief. It reached her eyes. "I hope it is better than your bread." He felt the rusty smile return to his own face. "A little." She walked toward him, toward the open door. For the first time, the house did not feel empty. It did not feel haunted by the ghosts of what was lost. It felt full. The wind stirred the laundry on the line, the clean white sheets billowing like sails, ready to carry them into a new, shared silence. The fire only changes everything, he thought, if something new is waiting in the ash. And as she stepped over the threshold, he knew, with a certainty that filled all the hollow places inside him, that the house had begun to breathe again. This story, you see, it isn't just about a rescue. It's not about a strong man saving a damsel, or a grand gesture of honor repaid with warriors and glory. It's quieter than that. It's about the small, almost invisible threads that can stitch two broken lives back together. It's in the shared silence across a dinner table, in a bowl of stew offered without condition. It's in the mending of a shirt, the sweeping of a floor. It's in the choice to leave a door unlocked, offering not just shelter, but trust, the most fragile and necessary thing of all. We all have our own kind of wilderness, our own kind of hitching post we feel tied to, and we think salvation will come like thunder, a dramatic and loud event. But more often, it arrives as a quiet shadow offering a moment of shade, a steady presence that doesn't ask for your story, but simply gives you the space to start writing a new one. It's the story of how we name each other, not with the labels the world gives us, the broken, the lost, the property, but with the names we earn through quiet kindness. The protector, the survivor, the healer, Lena, Elias. So here is your naming.